is a road to nowhere. Every main actor who is a decision maker is also a violator of the tech companies are equally complicit in both the AI ones and digital intermediaries, because I think often they pretend to care about FOE and FOA. What they lack is the will to train it, because they know it's not going to actually serve them as a profit-making entity.
And we've seen in the Israeli hacking of the Irani facial recognition systems within Tehran how they were used to essentially surveil and track the movement of Iranian leaders, leading to their killing. So in many cases, what we're seeing is that these surveillance systems that governments have can be used against them.
They'll listen to you for hours, they'll say things to you for hours, but also end up saying nothing eventually.
With artificial intelligence technologies developed in really two major countries, the US and China, and with artificial intelligence frontier models being used for all sorts of different purposes. And we've also seen the use of AI in social media algorithms as well as surveillance systems. Where does that leave the rest of the world that is not creating their own frontier models? And how do these governments in various different jurisdictions really regulate the use of AI? These are some questions that have been coming up a lot recently. So to talk about this, we're joined by Omar Rajaratnam, who's the Executive Director of Factum, which is a technology and foreign policy think tank based in Sri Lanka. So thank you very much for joining us, Omar. You've been involved in AI governance debates globally. And I think it's an interesting time that we live in because we're seeing these new technologies come up, a lot of hype and excitement around it, and a lot of foreign policy discussions also being based essentially on AI. We saw the visit of President Trump to China, in which primarily the discussions around AI and national security were fundamentally central to the entire exchange. So, in context of all of this, how do we see how global platforms are operating, how they're trying to follow domestic laws, and resisting government demands, but at the same time, how are governments grappling with regulating AI?
Thank you for having me, Usama and Dawn. I think to start with, how are the global platforms reacting to this, right? When we're talking of these platforms as well, I always kind of go back to two things. One is the company that actually owns the AI tool, and the other is the company that helps with the distribution of the content that is created by using these AI tools. So the governance structure to this, they can actually be packaged into one, but then there are two different avenues. But how they both responded is in a way that actually leaves a lot to be desired. Even as of now, yes, we actually take cover under, yes, maybe this government has an unreasonable request to the digital intermediary or the AI company to act a certain way, to remove a particular content, to seek more information on a particular content. All of this is happening, and all of this is a problem because both these AI companies and the digital intermediaries have different ways of serving different states. This really is problem number one that we actually face. We are never going to be in denial that some of the governments, especially in the global south, could also have oppressive or suppressive tendencies, and they're going to always think of using legislation to be able to stifle dissent, stifle free expression, stifle free assembly. However, it's also something that the tech companies are equally complicit in, both the AI ones and digital intermediaries, because I think often they pretend to care about FOE and FOA. But eventually, it just comes to their profit maximization that they care about, and that's why they've been serving different states with a different spoon. That's the key issue that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. And I think this is very relevant in the current context where we're seeing protests take place in India. And what we've seen is the response of the platforms leaves much to be desired. We're seeing, again, accusations of shadow banning, with folks from India reporting that a lot of their content is not receiving the kind of engagement it usually does. And what we're also seeing is that some content, a lot of political content related to the protests being marked as sensitive political content with interstitials behind it, which shows that the social media platforms are essentially limiting the reach of content related to protests. So that brings us to India's IT rules, which is one of the major examples in the global South, where we see very strict enforcement of these rules and laws by technology platforms. So, what responsibility do platforms carry, in your opinion, when they provide user data, remove political content, or restrict accounts under vague legal orders, including restricting content and its reach?
The main responsibility, and perhaps the key one, always is going to be the principle of fairness, really. If companies are able to treat every request that comes to them or every state with the principle of fairness, we'd probably not even be having most of these conversations. And you also bring up the Indian example, which is true. But the thing is also, when we actually think about it, which of us really even know if the Indian government, what are the requests that the Indian government is actually making of these tech companies for political content removals? There are no transparency reports on that. Right, we've actually known via research or via conversations that this happens, but there is not one single document in which there is a transparency report that actually says this government actually asks this tech company to remove this number, and this is what the compliance has been. Now, from the user side, be it from transparency reports that codes of practices that have actually facilitated, be it in the EU, in Australia and New Zealand. Of course, with Sri Lanka, despite being the first global South country to draft a code of practice, the global tech companies didn't sign up on it. Goes to show, again, this principle of fairness that I'm talking about. We do get treated with a different spoon. But in that sense, so that's the main responsibility that the tech companies have. And number two is also, removal of political content or content that actually promotes political dissent is always going to be problematic. However, and alluding again to your point about the Indian example of violence, because Sri Lanka has also had this example where online violence, the imminent threat of online violence actually being able to cause offline harm, if it's high, the algorithm also doesn't allow such violent content to be amplified widely. But like I said again, tech companies can also take cover under that and frame this as something that they do to restrict this political content because they fear that there could have been offline violence, letting that content, that online content actually stay on.
Right, and what you're describing ends up becoming major violations of international human rights law, especially, the ICCPR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees the right to freedom of expression, but also the right to freedom of association, both of which are impacted when footage or content related to protests, like we're seeing in India, is restricted. So, of course, companies have a responsibility to implement local law, but above that is the responsibility of implementing international human rights law, which applies equally to companies and governments. So, in that context, should platforms be conducting some sort of human rights due diligence before complying with state requests, even if that could mean challenging the government or risking restrictions?
Definitely, but I think the question is also, should the companies themselves be actually conducting internal human rights assessments, given their complicity in how they've aided multiple violences around the world? Israel's genocide in Gaza is one classic example. We can actually name multiple companies that are complicit in it. Some of them admit that they are a part of it, some of them don't do it. And it's just not the Israeli example. There are many more examples in which they've also been complicit.
Myanmar.
Yes, Sri Lanka itself sometimes, because in 2018, the Sri Lanka ethnic violence in a central province locality and a Myanmar violence is what led Meta to eventually admit their role in fostering or promoting that violence offline due to an online content. But the thing is, that aside, because we must also be willing to call out the complicity of these tech companies in being human rights violators to start with. So it also then puts us in a bit of a paradox to see how can we expect the companies to really conduct a human rights assessment of the government that is requesting this content from it. I have no solution to that issue. Or I mean, if anybody else, I've not really heard anybody have like a solution to that issue, except for that we also don't have an example, even as of now, of an EU-based company or any other country-based company that has become a social media giant or an AI giant that also balances human rights and promotes FOE as much as allowing for people to engage in that type of dissent. We just don't have that example yet. So therefore, it has also made it extremely difficult. And you rightly pointed out initially, frontier AI models are only based or centralized around the US and China. But the reality is, when it also comes to social media companies, it's really the US and China that is in the lead. We have no alternative that has had global reach from any other state or bloc really to start with. So given that, it's always going to be difficult to engage in this human rights assessment of it, because almost every main actor who is a decision maker is also a violator of the same human rights that we want to be upheld. I know I sound really pessimistic saying that, but I'd really also like to paint that real picture. Uh, and see, because this also then leaves the rest of the people who are affected by this type of online violence, or who are then impacted by that online violence in an offline setting, being able to only turn towards legislation because they just don't have any other redress in any of the other self-regulatory mechanisms that we talk about.
Right, because when there is a vacuum left by companies, states will jump in to fill that. Right? So there's that, you rightly pointed out, a paradox. And in this context, what we see is vague terms such as national security, public order, distress that are used in legislations and national legislations across the board, which then also leaves substantial room for selective interpretation and enforcement, right? And then also, I think the key contradiction that then emerges is that, can privacy rights protect citizens if the state can still demand to monitor all their digital activity through separate laws, right? So sometimes some states will have data protection laws, but at the same time, they'll have national security or anti-terrorism or safety laws that will then ask for a lot of data related to citizens, essentially undermining the right to privacy that competing legislations could offer. How do you see this paradox playing out in the Sri Lankan context and broadly?
I mean, this paradox really plays out prominently within the Sri Lankan landscape now, right? We have a really good Personal Data Protection Act, but we also have a Prevention of Terrorism Act, which the EU, to start with, and many other countries have also sought the repeal of. And the current government, which also came to power at the heels of an uprising, and promised us the sun and the moon when it comes to democratic reforms, has now also had nearly over 1.5 years to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which they have not done yet. Even last week, the Minister of Justice has actually said that they will expedite this process, but we've been hearing that quite a lot. So you're absolutely right. The paradox continues, but the only time this paradox can also be addressed if there is a government that is both politically willing and able to put a stop to this. There is just no other way to be able to stop this, because yes, when you also are in PTA consultations and you hear the government talk or their representatives talk, there is still a need to actually be on top of what terror threats can be. And the same thing then continues into the privacy component, right? If are people engaging in such illegal activity, right? And this also applies to the online spectrum, right? We talk of online harm. Illegal content, which actually mostly also includes terror content, is something that is non-negotiable. The problem is when you have a government that is actually not well intentioned, trying to use it under the national security pretext to stifle that dissent. And it's going to be a problem that is continuing even in Sri Lanka's context as well. The EU has repeatedly actually said that we may also lose general systems of preferences plus the preferential trade mechanisms that we have if we continue to have PTA. But again, they can ask of that, but they also have to engage with our governments on other bilateral matters as well. So this always gets swept under the carpet, and the paradox just keeps continuing. And the final one that is always the victim of this is the citizen. We have our privacy violated. And then we also have to face, when I say we, anybody who's actually taken in under a PTA detention has to suffer what that legislation also provisions for them to be held under detention without actually being tried in a court of law.
Absolutely. And with the advent of AI and its increased use, the scale of surveillance by the state has also changed, right? Because now authorities are able to process communications, identify individuals, map relationships. You have facial recognition technology, which can process all of this a lot faster than traditional legal safeguards can really respond. So how are you seeing this increase in surveillance that is facilitated by AI?
I mean, from a Sri Lankan context, I think we still lack an optimal capacity to be able to use AI for surveillance in a way that is actually going to be a mass threat really to widening civic space. However, it's not something that can be ruled out, right? Because we are also close to China, for example, which is actually a master of having used AI for that type of surveillance. Of course, they don't think it's oppressive. They don't think it's intrusive. I mean, they also talk about sometimes they talk about AI being used for just traffic detections, right? And facial recognition that actually comes thereafter. I'd want to actually also say that in some of these cases, both in terms of China, they've actually done this even before the rest of the world knew of the advent of AI. So I can only speak to like the Sri Lankan example of it, and I do definitely think that there is still a lack of capacity within law enforcement to be able to use AI for the level of surveillance that we want, but it is definitely not something that should be ruled out.
Right. And speaking of AI, one major criticism of it is that the AI systems are mainly trained on dominant languages, right? Like the English language or in the Chinese language, if we talk about the Chinese models. But these systems will often misread local regional languages like Sinhala or Tamil or other local language content, including satire, coded political speech, and the documentation of abuse. And we're also seeing this in the general use of AI by users and citizens, where language then is becoming a major issue. And we also see that, of course, the machine learning models don't have enough data in local languages. So, of course, that impacts the local context of the applicability of AI systems. What issues do you see that causing in different contexts?
Two things to start with on that, Usama, is that number one, this issue that you've just explained is not a post-AI challenge. We've had this pre-AI as well, right? We actually talked about content moderation mechanisms even when social media was becoming the next big thing, right? We initially started off with human-intensive moderation, um, content moderation, then we spoke of machine-aided moderation. And eventually what the tech companies realized is that they're not going to invest in this. And the AI companies are also doing the same thing, right? Yes, in the dominant language, it'll train data, but the thing is, if they want to, they also have the money and the skill to be able to train the same system on local languages. What they lack is the will to train it because they know it's not going to actually serve them as a profit-making entity. So I think we have to be pretty careful even harboring this fear that AI systems could actually misread these local languages, and therefore we have to somehow, steer clear of that. It's something that needs to be addressed, and it's also something that needs investment. And that brings me to my point number two. Almost all effort in such customization has come not from the tech companies themselves, but from civil society or the digital rights society, or the kind of grassroots AI groups that have wanted to include that. It shouldn't be that reverse. Because who's profiteering of all of this stuff? Who's profiteering of the data? Who's profiteering of the uh, just us existing on the online? It's the AI companies. So if they have the will, then this can be fixed. What's really lacking always is that, and their lack of willingness to invest in it, despite being the multi-billion-dollar companies that they are. So that's where I think the two main issues that I see with it. We should not allow the tech companies to get away with this excuse of misrepresentation and misreading. Our issue has to always be to push them towards investing. And if they fail to it, also look at how the time for consequences can be now. Because they really like the word consultation. They say this is also time for consultation. We've been in consultations for the past 10 years with digital intermediaries. The AI companies are actually using the same talking points from the same playbook. And we'll waste another 10 years on it. The problem with this, the post-AI era, is that we don't have 10 years to waste because it actually keeps changing perhaps every day. So that's what we need to really get.
So, Omar, what you're describing also relates to the experience of Sri Lanka, right? You referred to the role social media and the internet played in the conflict. And what we're seeing is that weak local expertise can lead to both excessive removals and failure to act on genuine threats, particularly against ethnic, religious, and gender minorities in all sorts of communities, right? So we're also talking about this risk of safety and security of internet users when it comes to this lack of capability among platforms. And you rightly pointed out that global platforms are also earning revenue and collecting data from global south markets, but without making comparable investments in local moderation, research, or user support. So, in the end, who is accountable when harm results from the interaction of these three forces, right? A flawed algorithm, an overreaching state, and a platform with little local presence. Where would you say the responsibility lies?
So the responsibility here also lies within these three parties who've actually at least the two parties that we're talking about, right? The big tech company itself. And we talk of the overreaching government, but which also then makes it look like it's not just the government, but the law enforcement agencies. So in conversations with the tech industry, they've always actually said is that some of the issues that we see online are not online issues. There have been issues that have actually existed within society, and therefore there is nothing much that these tech companies can do about it. We agree that these issues have been existence pre-technology or social media era or the AI era, but our problem is that the level of amplification or the scale of amplification has not been this significant in the pre-digital era. Therefore, the responsibility lies to start with the tech company because they also are responsible to resolve an issue that they have manufactured when it comes to the scale of amplification. Number two is also the checks and balances that even within an overreaching government that it can actually have, because often there can be independent commissions that also look at what needs to be removed and what shouldn't be removed. I mean, it's difficult because Sri Lanka also has has a legislation passed on the Online Safety Act, which also includes an Online Safety Commission. But civil society has also consistently rejected the establishment of an Online Safety Commission because they also feel that no matter how independent it is, when the independent commissioners are appointed by the president, um, how does it actually then become independent? So that's number two. But number three also is that when it comes to this removal, users themselves, from a literacy angle, this is also one factor that we must consider, right? Because critical consumption of content or the ability to discern from fact and harm, or fact and fiction, fact and disinformation, fact and hate speech, this is also key. So the
Mm.
responsibility still lies within these three. The tech companies are equally responsible, not equally. I think the weightage really is on them for the most part. Secondly, it'll come on to the government because they also eventually, in many of the election manifestos as well, they will promise you user safety, right? So safety maximization in the physical sphere is also something that they commit to, and whether we like it or not, in the online sphere, they have to actually commit to it. And the government of Singapore does this fairly well. And of course, it may not be the best example to always provide because it's also not a country that actually is known for its free expression laws or freedom of assembly laws. But last but certainly not least is also the responsibility on the user to be able to acquire this skill and stay updated, because you can also choose to say that you didn't know. But the last one, when I say that you can choose not to say no, is also really a bit of an urban or a suburban construct. There are still people, not just within the global south only, but also within the global north, who have no clue how to discern between an AI piece of content that is actually, showing you how dogs fight or a dog actually, kisses its owner versus uh, versus any other serious content that actually. So that capacity to also do that is important.
And yes, what you're pointing out to, is a lack of digital literacy. And of course, governments have a responsibility to include that in the curriculum, and to also, impart these skills within its public education systems as well, right? So what you're describing now brings us to, how do we build accountability, especially from the global south, of platforms, including AI platforms and internet platforms, right? So we've talked about content moderation, but we've also touched a bit on data collection, on government access, on automated profiling, on recommender systems, the algorithms, but importantly, also on the surveillance technologies that are sold to states, right? That are being exported. But there's very little accountability, on the proliferation of the spyware and other surveillance technologies. But also there's very little transparency, like you pointed out earlier, on how these systems function. And we've seen in the Israeli hacking of the Irani facial recognition systems within Tehran how they were used to essentially surveil and track the movement of Iranian leaders, leading to their killing. So in many cases, what we're seeing is that these surveillance systems that governments have can be used against them, right? So they become a national security threat against the very national security machinery that exists. So, keeping in mind all of this, how do we build accountability from the global south?
For us, first and foremost, if you're in the global south, we have one big problem around accountability, right? And this comes back to the frontier AI models really are centralized around the US and China. So our only partner really in that sense to lean towards is China, right? Because how do you actually otherwise build it? But then also there is this natural fear, but can that be like, the most reliable ally to do? To push towards this AI governance, right? But we've also kind of have started to talk about block-based cooperation, right? Because if it's not, but can blocks, regional blocks, or even extra regional blocks come together to invest in AI technology enough, but also in to invest in AI governance models enough, right? When we talk of ASEAN, because we talk of Singapore and again China, um, can ASEAN be the one that is going to come up with a formidable AI governance framework that the rest of the global South can follow? Do we then have the African bloc that actually also can do that? Then how is Latin America working on this? Then how is Asia working as a whole? Can these flow blocks come together? And I know like there are different blocks that we represent, but say something like the BRICS. Again, I'm very careful. It may not be the most progressive governments that we have within the bloc because they've all been found to stifle dissent in various of their times with in being in these blocks. Can these blocks also then come together to share knowledge, share capacity, but also share the best frameworks that they operate within to do it? Recently, I was also in. I had the opportunity to meet a partner within the African continent who've also come up with their own competition commission and the rules that actually govern how these frameworks need to be built. Of course, they've not touched on the AI component yet, but then that it could also be another framework that we look at. But with the block-based model that we're also suggesting, the block-based model also comes into being because the United Nations, as a multilateral body, has also either been delayed to come into the governance conversation. I mean, this is the first kind of AI gathering for governance and AI for good that we've actually had just in 2026. And this issue was in the making at least for the past 5 years.
Right.
And as a result of that, we have to actually go back to the block-based corporations. But when we go down to that, we have India is the other partner that we can look at. But given what is happening with and how they're stifling dissent within their own youth, could that also be a reliable partner for us to actually pursue for AI governance is another question that we have to ask ourselves.
Right. Omar, you've spoken about the issues with transparency, both on the AI companies, the social media companies, and also governments, right? Because we don't know how many requests are being filed overall. There's no disclosure of them. And then we're also looking at how overall transparency does not include enforcement outcomes by country, by language, by legal provision. And usually we just get top level data that, okay, yes, this percentage of requests was complied with or not complied with by platforms, but AI platforms are not yet doing this at all. This is only social media platforms that have been doing this after having been pushed by digital rights community over the years, right? Um, and you've then also talked about the need to have more localized systems for governance, right? So users having perhaps accessible local appeals and remedies, especially when an automated system is then affecting their speech, their safety, their livelihood, or even their legal exposure. So, keeping in mind all of this, do you think anything's possible in the South Asian Digital Rights Coalition? Within the region of these 8 countries, which includes a quarter of the population of the world. You've spoken already about, the Indian dilemma right now. But where do you think South Asian cooperation can lead to in this context?
South Asian cooperation in this context will have to be led by a track 1.5 approach. So mostly non-state actors getting involved to be able to share knowledge, share what their experiences are, what their landscapes are like, and coming together to suggest what progressive models can look like. That's number one, because it's a given. Not most of our governments don't actually believe that believe in absolute freedoms. And we can debate whether that's the right thing or not, but then it shouldn't actually stop the track 1.5 actors or most of the non-state actors actually getting involved to try and come to a solution with this. However, enforcement can't come from track 1.5 just alone, right? Because we are not elected by the people of a country. So we don't actually kind of carry that sovereign responsibility to be able to deliver to them. We must then engage with the decision makers, whether we like it or not. So that's a learning really for most of the digital rights and the civil society community within South Asia as well, because our experience with our governments over the years has been so bad that a default is not to engage them in this conversation. Right. And that really is to our own detriment, no matter how difficult these conversations are going to be, they need to be part of it. And then to be able to also take these conversations or these recommendations to the capitals where these tech companies are also based on. Because often we also speak with the regional lead of these tech companies to be able to present our stuff. And we've got the same answers mostly. They'll listen to you for hours, they'll say things to you for hours, but also end up saying nothing eventually and say, let me get back to you after escalating this or checking with our headquarters. So our outreach should also be to those headquarters directly and also look at ways how decision makers who sit within those headquarters, what are the forums that they are present in. And unfortunately, still, despite what the global majority's advances has been, no matter how many conferences we've had in global southern capitals, the real decisions are still made within the capitals of the global north. So I think I want to actually summarize. We start with the track point 1.5, engage our own governments in it, engage the tech companies in it at a regional level, but we shouldn't rely on the regional staffers to be able to escalate these matters to the headquarters. We should also be engaged in the headquarters of these capitals as well, and eventually the governments within those capitals as well. That's really the only way to go about it, because if not, and mostly within these Western capitals, when you share this information, it's also sometimes the first time that they've heard these examples that we have. And there is a bit of a light bulb moment that they have as well. And they do actually take some of this stuff then to their legislators and the tech companies, where some change actually eventually does end up happening.
And how do you see multilateral engagement, such as the UN or other platforms, on these issues as one avenue of solving issues?
A failure, really. That's what it has been. Because we are talking about, let's take the UN as a whole system, right? I mean, the Palais Wilson in Geneva actually hosted the League of Nations before. They host the United Nations now, and they have to move out of that building now too. It's a classic example of how bureaucracy really, self-made bureaucracy as well, has failed that entire system. And number two, they've also relied way too much on government funding for this. So they really have lost the agency to represent us as a community that actually needs this support, because they themselves are fatally dependent on the governments that are wronging all of us, or the tech companies that are wronging all of us for their own survival. And this is why I think initially also the kind of block-based system was something that we try and recommend. It's not to say that, the UN will still continue to, at least in the foreseeable future, at least in the next 5 years, right, be the forum where most of the leaders at least convene. So we will still have to be within that. But to rely on the UN to be able to drive the change and the solution, I personally believe is a road to nowhere. Because the talking points within the Geneva conferences of AI for Good and AI governance is a classic example that the leaders there have not grappled what this challenge is like. And they are, of course, repeating talking points that were written to them by some expert.
Right, because it's been catch up with the advancements in technologies that, like you said, a bureaucracy is unable to keep up with. Thank you very much for joining us, Omar, for this discussion. I think we've covered a large breadth of matters related to AI governance, also platform governance, and we have several recommendations also recorded in all of this. So thank you for joining us. That's it from us today. This is your host, Usama Khilji, signing out. We'll be back with another episode of Digi Pod on DawnNews English next week.